And we move on to a special segment. Well, one man's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. The European Court of Justice today proved this odd Western dictum yet again. In two separate rulings, the top court in Europe decided that the Middle East group Hamas is to be retained on the European Union's list of banned organizations. But in the other ruling, it decided to take the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, or the LTTE, the terror group that fought a separatist war in Sri Lanka for nearly 30 years, off its list of terror groups. Now, it argued that there was not enough evidence to prove that the group posed a threat after its defeat at the hands of the Sri Lankan armed forces in 2009. The Sri Lankan conflict was one of the bloodiest in the world. A total of 130,000 people were killed, mostly innocent civilians. And the countries of the European Union played a decisive role, not in defeating, but in aiding the LTTE in its bloody venture. And who could testify to this fact better than the chief gun runner and international fund gatherer of the LTTE himself? Listen it to what K. Padmanathan, commonly known as KP, told WION senior foreign editor Padma Rao in an exclusive interview to WION earlier this year.
There is a lot of criticism about the West's involvement overall, by sheltering people who fled from here, even after the war, a lot of LTTE cadres. What is it that makes them, made the Western countries take on and support and continue to allow, let's say, transfer of money to the LTTE at that time by separatist-minded diaspora?
Right. In fact, we'll try to play out that full soundbite for you in just a bit. But first up, this report. For 27 of the 3 decades of civil war, both innocent Tamils fleeing the violence, but also supporters of the LTTE in Sri Lanka had sought refuge in Europe. And in the name of their freedom struggle in faraway Sri Lanka, the EU states give them that and more. Padma Rao explains the peculiar relationship between the Tigers and Europe.
There are some dubious achievements to their name, like suicide bombs, like the forcible recruitment of children as fighters, like pushing civilians to the forefront of battle as human shields. They began in the name of a freedom struggle in the late 70s, but the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, LTTE, took barely 7 years to deteriorate into a full-blown armed group. The Sri Lankan civil war lasted 30 years and was one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. That the European Union is against the violation of human rights and for liberté, égalité and fraternité is understandable. It only takes a glance at the continent's own dark history to understand why. But one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. A total of 950,000 Sri Lankan Tamils fled overseas during the 3 decades of civil war. Most of them were innocent, people whose lives had been shattered, families killed. But there was also a growing number of LTTE supporters and strategists being sent abroad by the organization. And the West took them in. Simultaneously, European countries arm-twisted Colombo each time its army was on the verge of a final assault and sensing victory against the LTTE. They frequently held up development aid till the army laid down arms and agreed to enter peace talks. Each occasion gave the LTTE ample time to regroup, fortify and buy weapons. India too had for long supported the LTTE, but that support ended when India's Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was brutally killed by an LTTE suicide bomber. 9/11 proved a turning point for the United States. And where was the European Union? Still clinging to its stubborn beliefs, and in the interim, in the throes of influential Sri Lankan Tamil voters and rich businessmen who had made their fortunes on the continent. It is only in 2006, barely 3 years before the end of the decades-long war, that the European Union finally placed the LTTE on its terror list. The latest ECJ court verdict proves 2 facts: that the spectre of the LTTE's influence over the lawmakers in the European Union is well and alive, and that Colombo, to the EU, is a faraway capital of a tiny la-la land of their dreams, not a sovereign country with sentiments to be taken seriously. Padma Rao, WION.
All right. In fact, Padma is now with me here in the studio. Padma, talk to us about, we couldn't play out that soundbite fully. What did KP tell you at that point? And you've covered the, war extensively in Sri Lanka, and that too for the European media. What is it that the EU failed to see as far as the LTTE was, concerned? Like, what was LTTE's true avatar at that point? Did they fail to see that?
Well, it was, I'll go to the first question. I hope we get the KP bite back. I'm not sure. I think it should come on. But essentially what he said is confirmed what, people have been saying all along in Sri Lanka, irrespective of which government. And it happened to be the government of President Rajapakse during those years, that the European Union, in the name of human rights, which form essentially the bedrock of all European constitutions, were taking on, there's a total of 950,000 Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora in the world, almost, or in fact more than that number. And many of those, I would say the majority, were innocent civilians on the run from the horrors of the war. But there were a section of people who were LTTE supporters, LTTE, cadres, who took advantage of that human rights-based asylum policy of the EU and made their way there and got shelter, got refuge, and ran bank accounts and transferred money to the LTTE in Sri Lanka, which then bought arms. That's the one way in which the EU was not very helpful, I would say, to the war, to ending the war. And the other thing they did is to repeatedly push Colombo, to force Colombo to get back to the negotiating table every time the Sri Lankan armed forces were on the verge of a victory against the LTTE. And, and this would usually come in the form of some kind of threat of a withdrawal of, some form of aid or another. And Sri Lanka had suffered terribly during that war because tourism was down, its main revenue earner. It desperately needed the funds, and repeated governments, had to succumb. So these are the two. Of course, I'm sure this was unwitting, but then it just goes to show how many of these policies to support, movements which are very far away in countries which they know little about,
right.
Turn up, they end up financing them indirectly because in the name of a freedom struggle somewhere, far away. And it's, as the story just told you, it's only much later, in fact 3 years before the war ended, that the European Union came to its senses and banned the LTTE. So in a sense, today's verdict is very curious because it's the Court of Justice saying that the European Union, the body, did not provide the Court of Justice ample evidence, right. Which I find really hard to believe, and I suspect Colombo is struggling right now for an official response because, as you know, there is a new government in place in Sri Lanka, and this government has made tremendous efforts to, sort of console the international community, right. on the human rights, alleged human rights violations, etc. So that is,
but surely there's no threat to Europe from the LTTE within Europe. I mean, how would you assess that?
Well, the thing is that it's really only a matter of time, because there are still organizations which are still sheltered in Europe, in fact, as full-fledged European citizens. For instance, there is one of these organizations is called the Transnational Government of Tamil Eelam. Now, the name itself suggests, ostensibly, these are organizations that are interested in pushing the Sri Lankan government to examine the question of human rights violations during the last phase of war.
Right.
But they are still calling very much so for separatism in a separate state called Tamil Eelam within the tiny island state of Sri Lanka. So it's only a question of, I hope it doesn't come to that, but it's a matter of time before, something comes around to bite the hand that feeds it, So
right.
Of course, there is no direct threat right now, but then, one can never tell.
Okay, Padma, hold that thought, Let's also talk to our viewers now a little bit more about this. A reaction from Mahinda Rajapakse is up next. Sri Lanka is peaceful. The war there ended 8 years ago. Is there some logic in the European court ruling that the LTTE is no longer a threat? Former Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapakse, today in the opposition, is credited even by his critics as being the only Sri Lankan president to decisively end the separatist war waged by the LTTE earlier this year. He spoke to Padma in an exclusive interview for WION's Global Leadership series, and this is what he said.
Earlier this year, several former rehabilitated LTTE cadres were arrested for being part of a diaspora-hatched conspiracy to kill your moderate Tamil leader, Mr. Sumanthiran. And as you know, 2 years ago, Sir, 3 LTTE cadres, including one Gobi, were chased and gunned down, and weapons found all over again in the northern province. The Liberation Tigers have regrouped outside Sri Lanka, Mr. Rajapakse. Does all this mean that your rehabilitation program, which your government started, has proved to be a failure?
No, our rehabilitation effort was successful and humane, I would say. What has been a disaster is the weakening of our security forces and our, what you call this, security safety network in the former conflict areas, weakening them. So this has been a deliberate policy of the present government. I fear that a disaster is looming. But, you know, when we released them, about 12,000 people, we rehabilitated. Some people were rehabilitated fully. They went through the whole course. Then there are some people who had gone through only half of it. And there are people who had not gone through it because they have somehow managed to escape that rehabilitation program. So it all, you know, depend on that. And especially the LTTE diaspora is collecting money and they are powerful. So we have to have a good network, security network, intelligence network must be strengthened. They have weakened it, listening to the LTTE diaspora.
But if that rehabilitation program was so successful, what are these stories of LTTE resurgence? Are these just politically engineered rumors?
No, they are not. They are probably just the tip of the iceberg.
So it's much larger than that, you feel?
Much larger than that.
Well, it's interesting to hear out Mr. Rajapakse over there. But Padma, looking at this overall scenario with the ECJ now ruling, saying that there isn't enough evidence, what is the larger fallout of this, or the larger significance, so to speak?
Well, you know, ironically, Sana, it comes on the same day that a separate court ruling of the ECJ decided against a ruling by a lower court in Europe that the Hamas, the Middle Eastern group, should remain on the list, terror list. In fact, it's been, yes, be blacklisted. Now, the highest court has ruled against that and has kept it on the blacklist. Whereas in Sri Lanka's case, now the difference is glaring and obvious. There is massive international pressure, and there is also an intrinsic inherent thought process in Europe, understandably so, given the horrors of World War II and what happened there, that they do feel a natural desire to take the side of Israel, take the side of the United States on questions like Hamas. But when it comes to the LTTE, to say that there is no lack of evidence when government after government, including that of President Rajapakse, including the current government, have presented plenty of evidence in all possible courts of law, international courts of law, including the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, of the role that the presence of the LTTE and the sprawl of the LTTE across Europe, and that they say that they don't have evidence. I smell a rat, and frankly I smell, as I said in my story,
in fact, Padma,
I think it's indifference.
I'm being told that we have got that soundbite from KP. Let's play that out and listen into what he told you earlier this year.
There is a lot of criticism about the West's involvement overall, by sheltering people who fled from here, even after the war, a lot of LTTE cadres. What is it that makes them, made the Western countries take on and support and continue to allow, let's say, transfer of money to the LTTE at that time by separatist-minded diaspora in the Western countries? What was this that made it so attractive for them?
Actually, the Western countries, if you look, even America and other countries, they gave a opportunity to LTTE. Even they don't give the opportunity to Hamas. Even they win the election. The world, especially the West, they gave the good opportunity to LTTE.
All right, Padma, he said it, KP, in a soundbite over there. Now, just to wrap this up, closing remarks.
Well, I can only hope that the European Union, rethinks its stance and makes a fresh petition in the European Court of Justice, because the court, of course, is following, judicial procedures. And then the European Union came out with a statement today confusing the issue a bit, saying that what the court has spoken against is 2005 or 2009 to 2015. As far as 2015 to 2017 is concerned, the LTTE are still very much blacklisted. Now, we don't know what that actually means. Right. I think the best thing to do is wait and watch for a reaction from Colombo.
Absolutely. We'll leave it at that. Thanks so much, Padma, for joining us here and giving your perspective on that story.